And I would like to start with this sort of balance between the idea, the research question, versus the individual. We've touched upon it, and I would like to start here, and then I move in that direction. And then I hope for a discussion. So please, Arne.
I would actually start to remind you of something quite self-evident, namely that you only live once, and that you are mortal beings. I think you should remind yourself of this all the time. And the implication of this is that, first of all, I think that researchers should be more egoistic in the sense that they should stick to the question they want to know the answer to, and not care too much about what others want them to know. This is the first thing. This is the first thing I would tell researchers, and the thing that I've been telling myself throughout my career. That's the first thing. But the other side of the coin is that you should also tell the researchers to be less egocentric, in the sense that they shouldn't care too much about what others think of their research. They shouldn't be too much obsessed by having the desire to make scientific breakthroughs, because that might divert them from their own question. They should not be too obsessed by taking risks to be risky researchers. They should stick to their question, whether this question leads you into risky research or not. And finally, they shouldn't care too much about being interdisciplinary. They should, again, stick to their question, whether this question leads them into interdisciplinarity or not. Some questions that are dead important, dead interesting, are interdisciplinary. So this is, I think, and if you manage as a researcher to stick to your basic knowledge interest, then you really take a risk. The risk of being ignored, the risk of being not funded, and so on and so forth. So I think the important I here is the I of integrity. And the mirror of this in the funding agencies, I am one of these elderly people in the Wennergren research panel. I think that we do this. We get information about various things, also age index, the citation index, the publication list, how many conferences they have attended, how many postdocs they have done, and so forth, and so on and so forth. But what we almost always focus on is the quality of the idea, and to what extent we think that the idea can be applied in real research. So that would be my take on the issue.
Thank you, Arne. And Jonas, I know that you also are a bit hesitant to use the word breakthrough science or have it as a sort of vision. Tell us.
Well, I think it's important to talk about it, and as we've heard today, there's much intellectual labor is focusing on assessment and to some extent predicting who can deliver breakthrough research and how can it be done at the assessment level. But coming from the field of psychology, the last few years, as many of you know, our field is sort of shaken by the so-called reproducibility crisis, where a lot of research findings that were published in high-impact journals that were considered breakthroughs actually turned out to be non-reproducible. So that has given me some pause in thinking about breakthrough in a term of easily quantifiable and accessible way. So I think the discussion of the breakthroughs as an output of research needs to be balanced, to use the metaphor that was introduced earlier today. It needs to be balanced by focus on the process. So, for example, transparency, data sharing in psychology is fortunately taking the lead in this regard, using preprints have been around also in the biological sciences, but registered reports where you actually submit your work to a journal even before you have analyzed the data. So that incentivizes quality at the process and not just quality at the outcome. So I think there needs to be a balance there.
Great. Helena, what is your take on this?
No, I can only agree with sticking to your ideas and your knowledge and your interest and passion. I think we're facing today is that a lot of researchers tend to move into fields where there's a lot of money, because there goes trends into science, and you might come from different areas of research, which means that if you don't have the proper background, even if there's money there, you won't produce good science. So I think I can only agree with you. You have to stick to your ideas. The problem is still getting funded, since a lot of the money goes into these big programs in strategic areas of research, and then all of a sudden there's a lot of money, and people tend to go where the money is. And I think that is a problem.
And some research groups and researchers receive a lot of funding suddenly. So everything is sort of centered.
Yes, and I mean, we need the individuals. I mean, I can only agree, it's the individuals and the ideas, and you need to find the nerds that has the passion and have these ideas, and which you can't really put in a specific field. We still need to find those and to fund them. I think that's a challenge.
What has been most interesting when it comes to all the speakers today, do you think?
I think I really like, and I've heard this before, this with the lottery, and also have anonymous application. I think that sitting on the scientific councils, which I have for 2 years, I've been advocating a 2-step process where to get away from the bibliometrics, that you first get a resource proposal, which is completely anonymous, and then maybe in a second step you can get the CV, because that adds to the feasibility that this person has the knowledge within this field, has produced and published before. But that's feasibility. Because if you support projects, it's the research program that you should fund your decision on.
Thank you. And Maria?
A general reflection on the day.
Please, yeah, why not?
So I think it's been very nice to see the consensus that we have experienced today, with really open funding, freedom, and believing and trusting the scientists. And I can nothing but agree with Göran Sandberg to pointing out the lack of presence of university leaders here. And also, it would have been very interesting to have the political leadership here today to really communicate. I think that was interesting that was brought up as a very different approach in Denmark, where you have a close relationship. Because we are not islands. We need to work together.
Do you share Göran's picture that the leadership of the universities are much centered to compliance, much more centered to the compliance rather than the visionary building up of a university?
I mean, looking just at my daily life, it's more and more administration going on and being introduced, also occupying time. So definitely that could be one of the explanations for that. But it also gives me confidence, because we are in the Young Academy, we are touring the country and visiting universities and inviting university leaders to discuss the situation for young researchers. So it just shows that this is an important thing to continue doing.
And please.
I'm a little surprised about this. When I was a young researcher, perhaps the system is basically changed now. When I was a young researcher, I just received my PhD, and I applied for grants at the HSFR, which was the Humanities Social Science Council. I didn't care about leadership at all. I didn't even know who was the rector of the university. It was completely insignificant to me once, as long as I got my grants. So I didn't care about leadership at all. It was a non-issue for me. Today it seems as if it's the issue. So you have to explain to me why this is so.
I would be happy to answer what I think is important with the leadership, is that it also influences. I mean, they are taking decisions on how the internal money is being used. And then, of course, it's interesting to communicate so that you are able to affect how these decisions are taken.
I have another one. I think there is one issue where I think we disagree slightly, and this is about the issue whether we should talk about basic research as distinct from applied research. And I think you said in the morning that this is old-fashioned and a dated way to describe the research landscape. I don't think so. As Sven did in the morning, I think it's really useful and important to stick to this distinction. That doesn't mean that it's always possible to make a distinction, but sometimes it is. And the importance here is that it's important to defend a certain activities driven by person's interest in knowing things, whether there are societal implications or not of these things. And it's so important in these populist times to speak up for that kind of research. And I would call this kind of research basic research. So I think we should stick to the distinction without implying that this is always a distinction that we could make.
Let's hear what do you say about that, Helena? Are you happy with the distinction, or is it relevant at all for you?
No, of course I favor basic science, for sure, absolutely. And I think still it's important to make the distinction. What I see is coming more and more, and especially with this new Strut document, is that it seems to be more focused on education to meet the society needs and to link research more firmly to education, which means that then you direct research to a societal
I think that is a sort of linear.
So, and I think that's it's not by default that all education needs research associated. Many of our profession education, especially at the lower level, there's no clear merit why you should have a teacher that also does research. And I think this will dilute the money for research at universities. And the fear is that it will only lead to positions. And especially if then money is shuttled from the research councils and from other government agencies, then there will be less money to our daily work. We will have positions, but there's no money for doing the research. So I think this we need to keep really track on, and education is one thing, and there is a huge need for doctors and teachers and whatnot. I buy that, but all of that has to be coupled to research. All teachers should do research, and all research should teach. I don't buy that, and all are not suited to it. I mean, it's a possibility to do research. It's not by default a right. No. And it takes a certain skill to do it and to develop into a scientist. And not everyone will succeed with it. And I think it was brought up in the last panel and also from Lisa Lewis. I mean, what we really are bad at or suck at universities is to get the people out of the system that doesn't qualify, the below average. And as you say, if you want your future young scientists to have positions, then we need to sober up the system. We have too many teachers and researchers at our universities. And especially if this goes that all of them should have then research money, regardless of doing research, more or less by default. I think that's a huge threat to
so we need to sober up. Output. But Jonas, who is we then? And how will
I was just going to second. There is. I think the difficulty is the lack of accountability in sort of funneling money to research via the basic funding at the university. So if research is allocated based on educational need, there is no incentive to actually evaluate whether there is high quality research coming out of the system, and that is a great concern.
Yes.
May I raise another issue? It's about transparency. I was so impressed by Willem's presentation of the innovativeness of your agency. And I think what you're doing here is playing with non-transparency in the review panels. You don't tell the panel who is the joker in the room. And that's a way of concealing things for the panel. I think it's a good idea. I think it's a splendid idea. But I think about how things should be done from the applicant's point of view. Well, there is a dilemma with all reward systems. All reward systems that are well known to the applicants are exposed to the potential risk of abuse. So to address such a dilemma would be to say that the most simplistic conclusion of that would be the best system is the system that is least transparent. Because all research, I've been on both sides. I've been an applicant and I've been in panels, lots of panels. And we know that as soon as a new tool is applied by the agencies, a new incentive structure is applied by the agencies, new marginal grading system is applied, people start to adjust to that. So the thing is to arrange a system that is transparent at the same time as it does not entice people to be too strategic. How do we solve that dilemma? I don't know. But you see the dilemma, I suppose. Yeah.
But I think funding more individual project grant is one way, not to have this strategic research area, because then people try to get that money but by getting into those programs for various different reasons, and maybe not from the appropriate background, which I alluded to earlier. So I think it's the bottom-up effect and finding the best research.
And surprise them a little, be a bit proactive, I guess. Ask questions that they can't prepare. So, I mean, that is what we are in other areas of society. We are used to it, but in research, I don't know. What do you say, Jonas?
Arne and I talked before, and we agreed that we would disagree publicly on one thing during this panel before we go home. And as I understand your description of the random generator of funding in the Volkswagen Stiftung, I think a certain amount of randomness might actually open up for more creative research proposals. So it might not be a bad thing if people know that a wild card or similar can get funded. I think the problem of gaming the system is when it becomes too intensely streamlined, and you have higher proportion of really excellent proposals or high quality proposals. Then people start looking for reasons to
they will adjust to the system. And
I think this could be playing with fire, actually, but sometimes we should. But, well,
Helena.
But I like this approach for Volkswagen and the Lundbeck Foundation with the lottery, because I think it's quite easy and I'm sitting in as observer in the panels, and the really top application easy to define, and those that are not fundable. But then you have the middle section, which are clearly fundable, and there are very little differences in quality. And what you get then is a biased lottery. So then I think it's more fair to have a bona fide lottery, which is then completely unbiased. Because it's these small things that, and so it's basically a lottery in that group as it functions today.
Do you agree there, Maria? Or
well, I'm trying to think how would I do as a researcher if I knew I just need to write a mediocre application and then I can rely on the lottery?
No, but that's wrong. The mediocre ones are the non-fundable ones.
Okay, but I don't.
They are not in the equation.
I don't need to go for the 100% one. I can survive on the 80%.
No, but that's, I mean...
But I'm just trying to think.
No, that's not how... I mean, sitting in the panel, I mean, and this is the agony that the reviewers in the panel are facing, because these are excellent applications, so don't get me wrong. But and I think maybe it's not that big a difference, the ones that get tops like 6s and 7s in VR and those that get 5s. It's not a big difference, but there's a huge difference to those that are non-fundable. So these are excellent applications. That's important to stress.
But this also I think this reflects the problem with communicating any kind of randomized or a lottery. You remember Sweden, we had this discussion about free schools, and a lottery would place the children to school. It was not what they meant, but as soon as they used the word lottery, it was out there and it was misunderstood.
But I think it also highlights how adaptable researchers are. It was brought up in one of the talks that if there is this topic, then we can always fit in. And if it's, I mean, we know how to play the game.
One could try this as an experiment on a small scale, fine, but there are high risks in this. And I would say that to apply this as a system on a large scale, I would say would be the opposite to Christina's recommendation, that we should read the applications in a thoughtful way. That would be complete opposite. And I would also say that if this system were applied and also were made public, What trust would the public pay in science if we said that scientific quality is a matter of lot? I'm really, really skeptical, not to say against such a system.
That was what I was worried about too when it comes to communicating it. But Helena,
but I
please.
think, given that if you would have an anonymous application, the ranking and the grading would be based on actually having read the grant. And I think that's, and also this is thinking we should take the CV and the publication list out of the equation, at least initially, and focus on that and making the ranking and the grading based on that. To really put emphasis is this, what is the research and, you know, how do you want to go about it, what is the background, the rationale, and is it a sound and interesting and of high scientific quality? And then, yes, it's fundable. So absolutely you have to read the program. And I think, I mean, I agree with Jarrick that people read the program, but they are biased by the CV. I mean, I stopped reading the CVs. I read and rank all the proposals that I review, just reading the proposals. And then after having done my ranking, I look at the CVs. Because if I start by looking at the CVs, I have a prejudice already.
That's what it is. Okay. So any more comments or ideas how the research system can be more risk-taking in order to find the breakthrough science? Be a bit more. Have you anything more in your? You look a little bit, Jonas. It seems that you have something more in your pocket there.
No, well, returning to my earlier point about reproducibility in research. This is sometimes seen as something that's holding researchers back, and it's sort of tying our hands behind our back. We have to pre-register our hypotheses before we do it, and it kills all the creativity and such. But actually knowing how do we know that a research program fails or succeeds? That's not as easy as it may seem. At least not in the social sciences where I have most experience. So actually being able to publish and incentivizing publishing of failure, pooling data sets from successful studies and failed studies, that might free up a lot of time for other researchers because they don't have to go down the same rabbit hole. So before we had the reproducibility movement or reproducibility crisis, it was impossible to publish papers that were considered failures, even if the research was properly done. That means that probably for each high-level paper, 50 other labs in the world started doing the same type of research, and they might actually all fail. And that's a lot of money spent on nothing.
I think the way forward would be to do like Claes suggested earlier on this afternoon, that it should be less stress on novelty and more stress on quality. And in that sense, it could be high quality to launch a narrow program replicating an earlier study. It is as worthwhile to support as a more novel study. And the final word I would say is that I have difficulty seeing a system arranged that really support high risk, but there will always be people ready to take the risk of sticking to an awkward question, awkward in other people's views.
May I conclude this panel with asking you to just go back some years for some of you, and just give us a picture of what was it that made you a researcher in the first place? What was that question or that quest? Jonas can start, I think.
Actually, it was well. The question for me was I studied the sense of smell, and I heard from my professor in Umeå that smell impairments might be a diagnostic tool for Alzheimer's disease. And I was working at a retirement home, so I was working with people with dementia at the time. So that sort of dragged me into studying, well, can we predict early onset dementia using these cognitive markers? But what actually got me hooked on research was in part because that very same supervisor, the first thing he did was to send me to California for my bachelor's project. And I was really hooked on sort of the ability to move, to experience new cultures, new ideas.
So a life as
a researcher. And sort of stepping out of the comfort zone. And other people have talked about mobility, and I think that is critical.
Helena, what was in your mind?
So I think what really encouraged me or entrapped me was that, so this was in the early days of, maybe not the very first early days, but when molecular biology took off. And the enthusiasm, and being an undergraduate student then at the Department of Microbiology, which was buzzing with activity, that would really hooked me on science and to that field. So I started off as a molecular biologist. And that was because of the energy and the enthusiasm, and you've been to different departments and undergraduates and courses, and it was sort of dull and pleasant. And then you came there, it was frantic, and that's what really hooked me.
Great. Arne, what hooked you?
Well, two driving forces drove me into science or research. The first one was, I'm a child of the 60s, as you might already have figured out. And I wanted to change the world. That was my mission at the beginning. But I also had another driving force, namely my mother was a Jewish refugee. And I was always wondering about the ethical bottom line among people. To what extent can I rely on people? Can I trust people? When will they fall through? And this was a driving force behind my interest in doing research. And my position now is that whatever your incentives, whatever your extra scientific incentives, you have to be as detached as possible once you get into the academia.
Thank you. Maria.
Yeah, so I've actually tried to leave science twice, and I've
already.
Yes, already. And there are still days where I want to leave, and then I just remind myself that there's no point because I'm going to be pulled back anyways. But to live a life without constant questions and things to investigate and to discuss with colleagues, to work in interdisciplinary environments when you really are, striving towards a common goal and really wanting to change the world. I mean, I could not imagine life in any other way. So it's just fantastic to have this possibility.
Thank you all for sharing this, and thank you for a wonderful discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So it's time to summarize and wrap up. So I invite Christina Moberg again.
So may I first take the opportunity to make a correction that I've actually not been in a panel where the members have not read the applications. The difference is that in order to value the applicants, what you had to do before was to read several of their publications, and that is what you don't do today. So that was just the correction. But I would like to close this symposium by a quotation by the European Science Foundation and all European academies, ALEA, saying, "Science is expected to enlarge mankind's knowledge base, provide answers to global challenges, and guide decisions that shape our societies." So, of course, science is extremely important. And then, of course, it's important that we have reliability and credibility in what we do, but also to have quite a high quality. I will not summarize everything what we said here today, but I think that this was a very fruitful analysis of how to identify the important questions and how to promote high-quality science and research. We have identified a few words, a few keywords: quality, ideas, individuals, good conditions and creative environment, long-term funding, trust, risk-taking, diversibility of funding. And we also have concluded that we need a dialogue between the universities, the funding agencies, and the government. So I will then thank all of you who have contributed here. First of all, the invited speakers, and many of you have traveled quite a long way to come here, and we are very fortunate that we were able to share your experiences from other research councils, and also all other you in the panels who have participated, and also the audience who have participated. And of course, I also want to thank again those who made this possible, who funded this symposium, the Wallenberg Foundation, the Strategic Foundation, and the Swedish Research Council. So by these words, I want to close this symposium. Thank you very much, all of you.